Rancher was forced off his land by rival family, but his horse revealed something hidden in the barn. David Miller was 38 years old and had never spent a single night away from his ranch in his entire life. Until that day. The paper was on the porch table, folded in half, with the red stamp he didn't want to look at up close. But there was no escaping it. The Harrison family had filed a repossession order, and the judge on duty, within a time frame that seemed far too short for any reasonable person, had ruled in their favor. David had 72 hours to leave the land where he was born, where he learned to walk, where he buried his father, where he planted every acre of pasture with his own hands. 72 hours. When the officer arrived with the notice, David was in the corral cleaning the hooves of Storm, the bay horse with the burnt caramel coat he'd had since the animal was a foal. Storm lifted his head when the man came through the gate, and David knew, even before hearing a single word, that something very bad was about to happen. The horse always knew. The history between the Millers and the Harrisons was old, too old to fit inside a court document. The two properties sat side by side, separated by a barbed wire fence that David's grandfather had driven into the ground decades earlier, in a verbal agreement made with old Arthur Harrison on a Monday afternoon after Mass. A verbal agreement, that was all there was, because in those days, a man's word was worth more than a signed piece of paper. But time passed, old Arthur passed away, and his sons had no memory of that arrangement, or pretended they didn't, which amounted to the same thing. George Harrison, the oldest son, had hired a lawyer from a bigger city and presented an old deed to the land that included, according to him, the nearly 200 acres where the main house of Miller Ranch stood. The document was legitimate enough to convince the judge that there was a real dispute. And a real dispute was reason enough to remove David until everything could be sorted out. Remove, that was the word they used, as if taking a man off the land where he'd spent his entire life was something simple, like shooing a fly off the table. David packed the necessary things into a canvas suitcase that had belonged to his father. He put the documents he had into a plastic folder, grabbed clothes from the closet without looking too carefully at what he was taking, and went to the bedroom window for the last time. Outside, the pasture stretched as far as the eye could see. The grass was tall because the rain from the previous month had been generous, and in the middle of the yard, standing still as if he understood what was happening, Storm was looking at him. The man took a deep breath, and he left. He went to stay temporarily at Eleanor's house, a neighbor in her 60s who had worked on the ranch when she was younger and had never forgotten the Miller family for the kindness they'd shown her. Eleanor was a white-haired woman who didn't tolerate sad talk at the dinner table, but that night she stayed silent while David sat staring at his cup of coffee until it went cold without taking a single sip. The problem wasn't just losing the land, the problem was his mother. Mrs. Martha Miller was 67 years old and had been admitted to Oakwood Care Center in the newest part of town after a fall that had complicated her spine months earlier. The ranch was the asset that paid for her treatment. The cattle grazing on that pasture paid the monthly fee for the facility. If the land were taken away, David would have nowhere to get the dollars to keep his mother where she was, with the care she needed. He didn't tell Mrs. Martha anything. He thought sparing his mother was the right thing to do. But Eleanor, who had known that woman longer than David had been alive, said softly while washing the dishes, "David, your mother raised you without a husband for over 20 years on that ranch. You think she can't handle knowing the truth?" He didn't answer, because knowing and being able to tell were two different things. The next day, David went to the office of a lawyer he knew to understand what could be done. The man was serious, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and had a habit of tapping his pen on the desk while he thought. After hearing everything, he said there was a possible way out. If David could prove that the Miller family had occupied that land continuously and peacefully for more than 15 years, he could file an adverse possession claim. The problem was time. That took months, maybe years, and Mrs. Martha Miller's care center couldn't wait. David left the office with the sun beating down on the back of his neck and stood on the sidewalk for a length of time he himself couldn't measure. Pigeons flew low over the rooftops. A stray dog crossed the street slowly. Life kept happening all around him, while his own seemed to have stalled in place. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. It was that same afternoon that Eleanor called him urgently onto the porch. "David, come here. Look at this." She was pointing to the end of the dirt road that ran past the front of her house. And there was Storm. The horse had crossed the nearly 3 miles separating the ranch from Eleanor's house on his own, with no one knowing how he had gotten out of the corral. He was standing in the middle of the road, his mane tousled by the wind, looking directly at David as if he had something urgent to say. David walked down the porch steps and approached the animal slowly. He ran his hand along its neck, felt the warmth of the hide, and Storm let out a deep snort, as if relieved. "How did you get out of there?" he murmured. Storm didn't answer, of course. But the next day, when David returned the horse to the ranch corral and locked the gate with a padlock, the animal came back again. Same road, same time, same direct look into his owner's eyes. The third time it happened, David decided to walk the path back with him on foot, wanting to understand where Storm was coming from. They walked together down the dirt road, side by side, in the sun that was just beginning to turn orange. When they reached the ranch, Storm didn't head for the corral. He stopped in front of the old barn, the one at the back of the property that for years had been used for nothing but storing rusty tools and a few bags of fertilizer David had never finished using. The horse stood in front of the rotting wooden door and didn't move from that spot. I need to confess something here. When I first heard this part of the story, I was a little skeptical, but the person who told it to me looked me in the eyes and said, "The horse did that every day, David. Every day he went there and stood in front of that barn door." That's when I realized there was something serious behind it. David pushed the barn door open. The hinges groaned in a way that showed that wood hadn't been opened in a long time. The smell that came from inside was of dust, old mildew, of something forgotten. The light coming through the gap in the torn roof lit up the tools hanging on the plank wall, the stacked bags in the corner, and a long wooden workbench that had belonged to his father. David looked at all of it and didn't see anything different. But Storm walked in behind him and went straight to the workbench. He stood there, his muzzle almost touching the old wood, snorting softly. That's when David noticed. The workbench had a drawer he had never opened in his life because for as long as he could remember, that drawer had been stuck, and no one had ever mentioned it. His father never mentioned it. His mother never mentioned it. She had always been there, stuck as if she didn't exist. David pulled. The drawer resisted. He pulled again, harder, and the wood gave way with a dry crack that kicked up a cloud of fine dust. Inside was a folded cloth wrapped in thick plastic, yellowed with age. He took it out carefully, unfolded the cloth, and underneath the plastic was a manila envelope, sealed, with his father's name written by hand on the outside, Anthony Joseph Miller, and below the name in smaller letters, "To keep with care." David's hands weren't steady when he opened that envelope. Inside were 3 folded sheets and a handwritten note of 2 lines that he read more than once before he could understand what he was looking at. The note said, "Arthur gave me this with his own hand. Keep it here where only we know. One day this will be useful." The 3 sheets were a handwritten agreement, signed by both parties, dated a Sunday nearly 50 years earlier. Arthur Harrison and Anthony Miller had drawn up a document describing the exact boundaries of the 2 properties, with the signatures of 2 local residents as witnesses. The agreement stated that the 200 acres where the main house of the Miller Ranch stood belonged to the Millers permanently and irrevocably, regardless of any future deed that might appear in the Harrisons' name. David sat on the packed dirt floor of the barn for what felt like forever, those sheets in his lap and Storm standing beside him. What that man was holding in his hand could change everything, but it could also change nothing, depending on how much that paper was worth in front of a judge, and David knew the Harrison family wasn't going to take it lying down. He went to Eleanor first. Eleanor took the sheets, put on her glasses, read slowly, and when she finished, she stayed silent for a long time. Then she said, "David, I knew your father. He was a man who didn't lie and didn't hide things for no reason. If he kept this, it was because he knew he'd need it one day. But what if it's worthless legally? Take it to the lawyer. Today, still. The lawyer stayed quiet for a stretch that felt like an eternity while he examined the sheets. Then he took off his glasses, rubbed his eye, and said it was a private instrument recognizing rights. It wasn't a public deed, but it was a document that had been signed by 2 witnesses and that, combined with decades of proven occupation, could indeed change the outcome of the case. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a foundation, a real foundation. The problem, the lawyer said, pausing with his pen on the desk, is that the Harrisons will contest it. They'll say it's fake. They'll request a forensic exam. They'll try to delay everything as much as they can. How long will it take? If I file for an injunction tomorrow morning with this new document, maybe the judge will reconsider the temporary removal in a few weeks. Maybe. A few weeks. David did the math on the money he had in his account, the monthly cost of Oakwood Care Center, what he owed. It was going to be tight. Very tight. But it was what he had. What happened in the following days was a kind of silent war waged in county clerks' offices, in waiting rooms, and in conversations David never heard but felt the effects of. George Harrison showed up in town with a different lawyer, younger, in a dark suit, who spoke fast and had the look of a man who wasn't there to waste time. The document found in the barn was photographed, copied, analyzed. The Harrison family said it was forged. David's lawyer requested a handwriting analysis, which took time, cost money, and produced a result no one in the Harrison family wanted to hear. The handwriting matched Arthur Harrison's, according to comparison documents found at the county clerk's office from that era. But then came the second blow. George Harrison showed up at Eleanor's house on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, hat in hand, with the look of someone who was there to do a favor. Eleanor didn't let him in, but she stood at the door listening. He said he knew the document was legitimate. He said his father had made that agreement, yes, but that there was a verbal clause that had never been put on paper. The agreement depended on the Miller family keeping the fence boundaries in their original place, and that more than 20 years ago, David had moved a few yards into Harrison land when he renovated a section of the fencing. Eleanor went to the porch where David was and repeated what she had heard word for word. David just stared at her. "Is that true?" she asked. He took a while to answer, because the answer was complicated, because there had indeed been a fence renovation done by his father when David was still a teenager. And he wasn't sure where the fence had been before that renovation. There was no record. There was no one alive who could confirm it. No one, except his mother. David went to Oakwood Care Center that same afternoon. He walked into Mrs. Martha's room, where she was sitting in her rocking chair with a book in her lap, wearing a beige wool cardigan despite the heat. She looked at her son and said, before he even opened his mouth, "You came to tell me what's happening at the ranch." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. David sat in the chair across from her and told her everything. The document, the expert analysis, the Harrisons' claim about the fence. Mrs. Martha listened without interrupting, the book still closed in her lap, and when he finished, she stared out the window for a few seconds before speaking. "Your father renovated that fence when you were about 14. I was there. And I know exactly where it was before because I helped mark the path myself when we were setting the new fence posts. The fence didn't move an inch, David. It stayed in the same place. Your father was too honest a man to do something like that. Can you prove that?" She paused for a moment. Then she said, "There's a blue notebook in the cardboard box at the back of the closet in my room at the ranch. Your father wrote everything down in it. Every improvement, every renovation, every measurement. He drew the property boundaries by hand, with a ruler. If the notebook is still there, it has the drawing of the fence before and after the renovation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out." Now continuing, David went to the ranch the next morning before the sun was high in the sky. The Harrisons had one of their employees guarding the entrance, a young guy who knew David by sight and who was clearly uncomfortable when he saw him show up. David said he needed to pick up personal belongings, a right guaranteed by the court notice. The young man called someone, there was a quick conversation, and in the end, He opened the gate without saying a word. The room was exactly as David had left it. The closet was closed. The cardboard box was in the back, exactly where Mrs. Martha had described. And inside the box, among old documents and photographs and a wooden rosary, was the blue notebook. The cover was stained with moisture, but the pages were intact. David opened it in the middle and flipped through slowly, and found what he was looking for. A pencil drawing, traced with a ruler, showing the ranch boundaries with measurements noted on the side. On the next page, a second drawing with the date of the renovation written at the top and the new fence posts marked with an X. The measurements matched. Point by point, the two fences were in the same place. He stood in front of the open closet with the notebook in his hand, feeling his heart beat in a way that mixed relief with a sadness he hadn't expected. Because holding that notebook was like having his father back for a second. Those small, careful letters, that habit that seemed boring and was actually the thing saving everything. The lawyer submitted the notebook to the case as documentary evidence. The forensic examination confirmed that the date written on the cover was consistent with the paper and ink of the era. The land drawing matched the current topographical survey. The Harrisons' claim about the fence line couldn't hold up in the face of that. George Harrison requested a conciliation meeting before the case went to trial. David's lawyer considered the proposal, listened to his client, and the two of them went to the meeting in a conference room at the county clerk's office in town. A long table with brown upholstered chairs and a ceiling fan that spun without doing much against the afternoon heat. George Harrison walked in with his youngest son, a man in his 30s who wore the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. The older man was different from the time he had shown up at Eleanor's house. He was tired, and David, looking at him, realized George Harrison wasn't a storybook villain. He was an old man who had grown up hearing that that land belonged to the family, who believed what he'd been told, and who now stood before the evidence that what he had inherited wasn't exactly what he thought. George was the first to speak. "I didn't know about the agreement my father made with your father. I'd swear to that in front of anyone. What I knew was the deed, only the deed." David looked at him for a while. "I believe you, sir," he said, and it was true. What became clear in that meeting was that the conflict had been born of a forgetting, or perhaps an omission, that old Arthur Harrison had carried without telling his children. The agreement existed. The boundaries were documented. And the deed the Harrisons had used had been drawn up before the verbal agreement, which meant the document found in the barn was, in practice, a correction to that deed, never registered at the county clerk's office because the two old men trusted each other too much to imagine it would be necessary. The conciliation lasted 2 hours. In the end, it was agreed that the Harrisons would recognize the original boundaries of Miller Ranch according to the father's agreement, waiving the repossession order. In exchange, David agreed to allow the Harrisons to use a path that crossed part of the ranch to access a portion of their land that was landlocked. An easement, as the lawyer called it. A small thing. A reasonable thing. When they left the county clerk's office, George's son stopped on the sidewalk and said to David, almost without meaning to, "My grandfather was a complicated man. I think he never told my father out of shame. Because admitting there was an agreement meant admitting the deed was wrong." David put his hat back on and looked at the young man. "You don't get to choose the mistakes of the old folks you inherit," he said, "but you can choose what to do with them." Sometimes a person says something like that, so simple, and it stays in your head for days. I spent a good while thinking about that phrase. David returned to the ranch on a Thursday morning, with the sun still low on the horizon, and the air carrying that smell of damp earth that lingers after a night of drizzle. Storm was in the corral, as if he hadn't gone anywhere. When David opened the gate, the horse trotted up to him and rested his muzzle against the man's shoulder, who held that huge head with both hands and stood there for a while without saying a word. The first thing he did was go to the barn. He opened the wooden door, which still creaked the same way, let the light in, and looked at his father's old workbench. The drawer was still open, empty, the cloth folded beside it. David put his hand inside the drawer and ran his fingers across the sanded wood on the inside. He thought about his father, who had kept that thing there, who had written that 2-line note, who had trusted that one day it would serve a purpose without knowing when or how. He thought about how his father had prepared the defense before any battle existed, like someone who plants a tree, knowing they'll never sit in its shade. That same day, David went to visit his mother. He walked into the room and she was standing by the window, a scarf around her neck and her white hair pinned back. When he told her he had taken care of it, that he was back, that the ranch was secure, Mrs. Martha didn't cry. She just looked at him with those eyes that carried 67 years of life and said, "Your father knew this day would come. That's why he kept it." "You knew about the notebook?" "I did, but I didn't know about the envelope in the barn. That one he kept just for himself." David went quiet. "Mom, you never told me about the agreement with old Arthur Harrison." She sighed, slowly, because it never needed to be told. And when it did need to be, I was here. She made a gentle gesture toward the room. "And I figured you had already lost. You thought I was going to lose." She turned her head toward him with an expression that mixed firmness and tenderness. "No, son, I thought the land was going to win. I always did." In the months that followed, David renovated the barn. Not to erase what had happened, but because the place deserved to be cared for. He replaced the rotted planks, rebuilt the roof, sanded down his father's workbench and oiled the wood. He left the drawer open. Empty, but open, like a memory that doesn't need a hiding place. Eleanor came to visit when the renovation was done. She stood at the barn door looking inside for a while, arms crossed and a small smile at the corner of her mouth. "Your father would have loved to see this," she said. David nodded, and Storm, who was in the pasture nearby, lifted his head as if he had heard. End of story. And that's it, folks. This story touched me deeply because it's about something that goes beyond land and legal papers. It's about the inheritance we can't see, the one that stays hidden in a closed drawer, in a blue notebook, in the silent faith a father places in his son without a word. Tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. Do you think David did the right thing by accepting the agreement with the Harrisons? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you so much for always being here. Take care of yourself. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.